And welcome to the Gay Liberation Network here on CAN TV. I'm your host, Andy Thayer, with the Gay Liberation Network. And with us tonight is Miss Romero, who is a Honduran student in the United States. She is a master's student in social work at Loyola University. And she is going to tell us a lot about Honduras tonight that probably a lot of our audience doesn't know about. Honduras is a Central American country that the United States has had a long-standing relationship with that probably most people in the United States are not aware of, that it has been a principal target of U.S. military intervention over the decades. For those of you who are old enough to remember the so-called Contra War against the government of Nicaragua, where the United States supported terrorists who would go over the border and slaughter Nicaraguans in an attempt to destabilize that left-wing government. That was all based in Honduras. Honduras has received a lion's share of military aid. It's been seen as a linchpin of U.S. military strategy to control not just that country, but the entire region, the Panama Canal, and so forth. So that's just basically a quick setup as to where Honduras fits into the United States realm of trying to control other areas of the world, which obviously Central America is not the only one. But Giselle, what do you think are some of the most common misperceptions about Honduras and the region that Honduras finds itself in that you'd like to correct for a U.S. audience?
Well, some of the misperceptions I would say were just thinking of these countries that have so much violence and thinking of the people as, you know, possibly violent people who have no way of creating a way of life for themselves, and not seeing all of this involvement that the United States has had in the past and up until recently with the coup that occurred.
And the coup was in 2009 and against an elected, perceived to be left-wing government, Manuel Zelaya. It happened under the Obama administration. Hillary Clinton was the Secretary of State. The Secretary of State's office apparently had prior knowledge of this military coup, and yet Hillary Clinton bent over backwards to stop the diplomatic isolation of the new coup regime. It was illegal under U.S. law. What followed, the military aid. And tell people what happened after the coup.
Well, after the coup, Hillary Clinton tried to move the situation forward as quickly as possible to get people to accept that the coup was going to be a reality and that things would not change, that things would not go back. So she tried to smooth things over and try to implement, and they did, a new president in power. So they went against what you said would be the politics of
the law of the United States.
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah. And in the wake of that, Honduras grew to have the highest murder rate in the world, as basically the oligarchs, the small number of families who controlled the country and grabbed the lion's share of the resources, did everything in their power to hold it back. Ironically, the official rationale for the coup was that Manuel Zelaya, the president who was illegally overthrown, was in the process of instituting constitutional changes that would allow him to remain in office. That wasn't the case. That basically there was, President Zelaya had instituted things like a minimum wage. He had strengthened the ability of campesinos to maintain and get control of their land.
Sure.
But that was too much for the oligarchs.
Yep, absolutely. And he had protected a lot of the natural resources of the people, especially the indigenous people. And that's something that's related to Berta Cáceres, because he protected their lands. And soon after he was taken out, many companies were allowed to come in with a new administration and take over those lands and start contracts to do projects on those lands.
Could you say a few words about who Berta Cáceres is? Because the people on the left know her internationally as a great freedom fighter. But if you could say a few words for those who may not be familiar with who she is.
Sure,
Or
absolutely.
was, I should say.
Absolutely. Well, I feel like no matter what I say, I won't do her justice. But she was someone who was fighting for the rights of her people. She was part of the Lenca indigenous group in Honduras. And she was a community organizer. And she fought back. She started a campaign to protect their people's water because this company wanted to come in and start a dam without their permission. They did not ask anything of them. They didn't ask for their opinion, and they fought back, and they got them to go away. And they got them to pull out of trying to do this dam, and she fought for that. And she fought for the rights of all people. She was an anti-capitalist. She was an anti-racist. She was anti-patriarchy. So she was a woman of the people. And sadly, we lost her because of her fight and apparently where we're going in the world, that we prefer to go towards profits instead of protecting the rights of people, protecting the land.
Berta Cáceres was murdered in March of last year, and as part of honoring Berta and her struggle, and the struggle of so many others who have been murdered for their activism, we're in the Gay Liberation Network are going to be partnering with a number of other organizations for a very important event coming up at the end of this month, and I'd like to pitch it to Giselle to tell us a little bit more about that. It's coming up on your screen right now.
Sure, absolutely. So these are two of one of Berta's closest friends who are doing a tour in the United States because one of them, Melissa Cardoza, she started a book called 13 Colors of the Honduran Resistance. So she's doing a book tour around the country. And she's also with her friend, Carla Lara, who will be doing this creative presentation for us. So Melissa Cardoza is also a poet, so it'll be a beautiful creative presentation in honor of Berta Cáceres and also promoting the book that really talks about the resistance movement that they have, and many of these movements led by women, led by indigenous people. So we imagine it'll be a beautiful event.
Yeah, and that's going to be coming up on Friday, April 28th at the Burger Park Cultural Center located at the corner of Granville and Sheridan Road, just a short walk away from the Granville Red Line L stop. It's a free event. If you really want to find out about what's going on in other parts of the world, don't read the Tribune. You will find precious little. I went to a similar presentation organized by La Voz de los Bajo, which is a Honduran solidarity organization, a few weeks ago, and as I remarked to several people, I learned more in 15 minutes than in 2 years of reading the Chicago Tribune. So we'll be bringing this information up on the screen a little later in the show, but another event that we really wanted to call people's attention to is the upcoming May Day event here in the city of Chicago. There are a number of organizations, literally dozens of organizations who are going to be coming out on Monday, May 1st. The main event is going to be at 1 p.m. at Union Park at Ashland and Randolph. There's also going to be a very large feeder march beginning at 11 a.m. from the Cook County Juvenile Detention Center at the corner of Ogden and Roosevelt Road. It is the largest juvenile detention center in this hemisphere. It says something about the screwed up priorities of our country that we are spending so much money on locking away our youth at a time when we have record youth unemployment. We've got a violence rate in this city. We don't need to talk about Honduras. We've got a violence rate in this city which is in large part due to the lack of resources that youth have, from education to jobs to cultural activities. So please check out the May Day March. This is going to be a multi-issue march dealing with immigrant rights, with worker rights, and I think probably feminism, and we in the Gay Liberation Network will be there speaking for LGBT rights and much besides. So please come out Monday, May 1st, and we'll get that announcement up on the screen at the close of the show so you can discuss it more. Honduras right now is, from my reading of it, is sort of in this nether region of they have formal elections, and yet so many candidates get killed, that so many activists, especially so-called second-tier activists, get killed by the wealthy and their armed guards and so forth. And you had a term for it when we were discussing about it, that what's going on is reflective of so-called neoliberalism. Could you say a few words about what neoliberalism is and what it's meant to the people in Honduras?
Sure, absolutely. So neoliberalism is this ideology. They came really into power in the United States right after Reagan, when Reagan came in. So this idea of letting the market run free, of privatizing public institutions, public sources of public resources, the privatization. And it has led to, for example, in Central America and Honduras, this sense of like oligarchy, because the government lets all these companies come in and take away the resources of the people, take away the land of the people, and not take into consideration their needs and their livelihood. And then taking away the resources, the public resources, and trying to privatize.
The dollar rules everything.
Exactly.
Yeah. And rather than things being produced or distributed for people's needs, it's, well, can we make a profit off of it? I'd like to note that the telephone number on the bottom of your screen, if you want to call that number to join our conversation with Giselle with a question or comment about the situation in Honduras, we encourage you to do that. Right now, we're going to get some pictures of Honduras up here on the screen and continue the conversation. Honduras, I've had the honor of visiting a couple times as part of Solidarity delegations. It's an incredibly beautiful, verdant country, as you can see here from the countryside. This is a picture of Tegucigalpa, the capital in the center of the country. But there's also the military. There's also a heavy police and heavily armed situation. And all those guns, by the way, they come from the United States. Let's be clear about that. And activists I spoke to, I asked, well, what should people in the United States should be doing? And they almost universally said, stop sending the guns, they're killing us. And all these uniforms and so forth. And here, this was at a human rights organization called COPIN that we visited in Tegucigalpa. You see how many families have been devastated by these political murders and just violence in general. We had the honor of speaking to people talking about their struggles to deal with what Giselle is talking about, neoliberalism, just to survive. And these guards you see on your screen, these were guarding a plantation in Toccoa, which is a city in the north of the country, which had a particularly high level of violence, as the oligarchs did whatever they could to defend their wealth and steal it, frankly, from the poor, some of whom you see here. This was a particular guard that we encountered at this scene here. The oligarchs had sent in their goons basically to invade a local neighborhood. They fired off tear gas and killed an elderly gentleman. Of course, there were no consequences to these guards who were allowed to be masked like that. And tear gas canisters littered, of course, the neighborhood, and they were, of course, all made in the United States. But there is resistance. This is one of the left-wing parties spray painted the sign to the local police station there, which I thought was quite amusing. And during Honduras Independence Day parade, when I was down there, people came out in spite of the violence. I mean, thousands of people, and they took over the local podium where all the important rich people were to, as you can see, the expression on this gentleman's face. We're not very pleased about what folks were doing. Now, Giselle, a lot of people just think of immigration in general. They think Mexicans, but the reality is that in spite of having about 8 million people, which is far smaller than, say, Mexico, a huge proportion of the immigrants who, in past years, who came to the United States came from Honduras. Could you talk about some of the reasons for that, please?
Sure, absolutely. A lot of it has to do with, like we talked about, the neoliberal policies that came into place that took away a lot of the power from the people, took away a lot of their ways of making their own money. In Mexico, we had this deal, the NAFTA deal.
Right.
There was its own kind of deal that was done in Central America, which took away a lot of the way that, farmers could make their money, for them to make money. So people have no way to make their money. And if you have companies coming in and taking things over and flooding their systems with cheaper, we talked about sources of grain.
Right.
So how are people supposed to make their money? So they have no other choice than to have to come north and to make their way towards the United States, chasing a dream. They just want everything that we want as well, to have a healthy family, live a good life, a peaceful life. And due to all of this going on, there's also a lot of violence going on due to many gangs, and also there's a lot of talk of corruption and the government being involved with a lot of the drugs going on as well. So there are many layers to it, but people are leaving because they have to.
Yeah, well, and I think it's important to drill down on some of the myths that the neoliberals like to push. One is that they're in favor of quote-unquote free trade. The NAFTA deal, and it was called CAFTA for Central America, these deals were not about free trade. They were about creating a trade bloc with the United States and other countries versus the rest of the world. And while they talk about free trade, United States agriculture is enormously subsidized by the government. It's an enormous subsidy, and what happens when you lower the trade barriers between the United States and another country is that heavily subsidized grain then floods into the rural markets. People who have small plots of land growing corn or what have you find that they no longer have any market for their corn because of the U.S. grain flooding in, and then people have no income. So what do people do? They leave, or they enter the drugs trade. I mean, you look at the situation here in our own city. Why do people take the very dangerous route of dealing drugs?
Right.
It's a very, very dangerous. It's because there are not other safer, realistic opportunities. Now, before the show, we were talking about some of the parallels between Honduras and the United States in terms of how each country has treated its indigenous populations. Could you repeat
Sure.
for our audience a little bit about that, please?
Absolutely. So part of the struggle that Berta Cáceres was protecting the land of her people, protecting the water of her people. And you can compare that to the struggle that people were fighting against for the Dakota Access Pipeline in North Dakota. The Sioux tribe there, fighting for their water.
Yeah.
They were saying, this is what you're doing could potentially poison us. It could harm our people. And the disregard for them and for their livelihood is, you can easily, that's what's happening.
And for
in
treaty
Honduras.
rights. I mean, in North Dakota, these treaties that the United States formally signed on to, and of course breaks.
Exactly.
And the Linka people, whom Berta was a fighter for, again, that was their land. It wasn't, so.
Yep, absolutely. And also, there's a people in Honduras called the Garifuna people who are of African ancestry, who are also fighting for their land, because there's also a huge push to do mega projects on their land. And again, completely disregard for them, and they are also doing a lot of resistance and trying to protect their people and their livelihood.
So with the new Trump administration, are we hoping for benign neglect? Is that the best? What are your thoughts in terms of the future of Honduras with the new administration?
Well, my my hope is the continued resistance of the people. I think that's the best we have, and I think that's what has always been the truth of history of struggles of people who are oppressed, that we need to keep fighting on, we need to keep pushing forward, because we are the ones who have to try to bring about try to bring up that consciousness from the oppressor, to see that we're doing things wrong. We are not, instead of protecting the land that we're already seeing, there's been a lot of destruction, and we're seeing a lot of issues with climate change. We're going backwards when we should be really moving towards protecting Mother Earth, which is what Berta talked about.
And one of the things that I think a lot of people in North America don't realize is my experience talking with activists in Honduras is that they were practicing intersectionality before the word was a common buzzword on the U.S. left, and doing it a hell of a lot more effectively, even though we toss around the term here in the United States. That Berta was a feminist, she was a fighter for indigenous rights, she was a strong supporter of LGBTQ rights, and in many respects the movements, to refer to them in the plural in Honduras is a misnomer, because people, whether or not they are trade unionists, they support trade union rights. If they're campesinos, for example, that people who are not LGBT support LGBT rights. That the silver lining on what happened after the 2009 coup was that people realized that they needed to have solidarity with one another if they were going to survive, because the government was killing activists, the oligarchs were killing activists, and some of the LGBT activists I spoke with said, well, before the coup, we only concerned ourselves with our own issues. AIDS, sexual rights, that's it. We didn't even think of other people's rights. And the one good thing, if you will, about the coup is it forced everyone to realize that we have intertwining interests, that we're not just LGBT, we're often campesinos, we're often trade unionists, we're women, etc., and we are stronger together. And so I think there is a lot, from my reading of the Honduran movement, that people in the United States can learn from. One thing before we go, I'd like to discuss a bit about the current political situation. There is going to be another presidential election coming up this fall, I understand. The current president, Juan Orlando Hernandez, pretty clearly stole the election. And just for those of you who are not familiar with Honduran politics, the last election, and I had the honor of being part of a delegation to Honduras at the time, we didn't realize it fully at the time, but it came out later that the National Party, which is Juan Orlando Hernandez's party, basically stole from their equivalent of the Social Security, the pension system, and it's very well documented. It's not just conspiracy theory stuff. And they used that money to basically buy off a number of smaller, lesser parties who would have their own election observers at all the polls. And so basically you would have, say 6 parties, 5 of whom were basically allied, in one alliance, and certifying, yes, these votes were all correctly tabulated, boom. So people in that election, in the resistance, spent a lot of resources trying to do things the so-called proper way, the electoral way, and it failed. What does that say to you, Giselle, about the way forward?
Well, it's hard for you to have confidence in what occurs. So again, my only thing is, keep fighting on and see what we can do, see how we can hold people accountable. But it's hard for you to have confidence, especially when people who have all this power can do so much. But as you can see, people have continued to fight, and we'll see how we can hold people accountable.
And there is, I understand, a bill in Congress, not that we've got any confidence in Congress, to cut off U.S. military aid. I mean, the Democrats didn't do it when they had both houses of Congress. What do we expect now? But nonetheless, this bill, and I'm sorry that I don't have the number of it handy, the benefit of the bill, I think, is to raise the issue, if nothing else, that this is something the United States should have done a long time ago. And for all their brutality, things haven't gone all the way they wanted to. The murder of Berta Caceres in particular raised a firestorm where the government has been forced to arrest some people, but of course the people at the very top who ordered the killings are of course free at this point. With that, I'm afraid we're going to have to wrap things up here, but before we go, I'd like to again remind people about the event on April 28th. Tell us a bit about that, Giselle.
Sure. So, I think this event will be a way to remember Berta Cáceres, and two of her closest friends will be with us. Sharing, Melissa Cardosa will be sharing her book on 13 Colors of the Honduran Resistance. So sharing stories of what people have done to resist.
And it's like a cultural presentation. Don't come expecting a boring lecture or anything. This is going to be a fun and educational event. Again, it's Friday, April 28th, 7 p.m. at the Burger Park Cultural Center, just a little bit south of Loyola University. There are several Loyola organizations, the People of Color Social Workers Organization, I apologize, I don't recall the name, as well as other student organizations at Loyola University who are partnering with the Gay Liberation Network and La Voz de los de Bajo on this event. It's great. Please check it out. It's all free on Friday, April 28th. And then, of course, there's May Day coming up Monday, May 1st, and that's going to be, the main event is going to be at Union Park, which is at Ashland Avenue in Randolph, 1 p.m. Monday, May 1st. Check that out. And then finally, we'd just like to thank some of the folks who have helped us out with tonight's show.